Hello and welcome to Chapter 40. Chapter 40 is going to be all about ecology, which is going to start our ecological unit of chapters 40 through 43, where we're going to be thinking about organisms and their environment. And it will also be a good interlude to thinking about things such as genetics, cells, and evolution. And these interactions that we're going to be looking at throughout these four chapters are really going to be thinking about where do we find organisms and how abundant are they in an environment. Now, I'm going to first start by just briefly talking about different types of ecologies that we're going to be seeing throughout these four chapters, and one of them is ecosystem ecology. This is where we're really thinking about energy flow and chemical cycling, and how those biotic and abiotic components come together. So when we talk about biotic components, we talk about living factors within an ecosystem, such as competition between squirrels and chipmunks. And abiotic components are things like rainfall or sunshine. Now, the way that we can think about an ecosystem is that it's just a community of organisms in an area and with physical factors that they interact with. So the bears and deer and chipmunks on Mount Mansfield and how Mount Mansfield's climate influences all three species. We can talk about community ecology, which just deals with just species. So we're taking away the abiotic factors, and now we're talking about communities. So we might be thinking about how deer and tick populations interact within a state forest, or how chipmunk and squirrels are competing for acorns. Population ecology is a subset of community ecology where we're really thinking about one population or one species over time in a given area. So we could be looking at humans in Stowe, Vermont, or bears on Mount Mansfield. We're just really thinking about how is that population changing over time in terms of growth rate. And then the last can be organismal ecology, which we're really looking at just a specific organism's structure, its physiology, and also behaviors for how they meet all of those challenges. So we can think about questions like, how does your microbiome change with different types of diets? Why do humans have lighter or darker skin? We're really thinking about physiology, so anatomical features, evolution, how do those features change, and also behavior, because behavior in many organisms, including human, are partially coded by genes. Now, to begin, we're going to be just talking about some of the brief, broad variations that cause different climates to have various abiotic factors, and one has to do with the fact that Earth receives different amounts of sunlight at different latitudes. So the highest average sunlight throughout the year is always going to be at the equator, and as we move north and south, generally we are going to have variations and declining amounts of sunlight and solar radiation as we move towards the South and North Pole. Now, you will know, hopefully, that Earth does not have a straight axis. Rather, we have about a 13.5 or a 23 degree tilt, not 13. And that means that as the Earth orbits the Sun at different times of the year, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere get different amounts of sunlight. We obviously know in the winter that we get the minimal amount of sunlight, while in July and June we get the maximal sunlight. And the same is true for the southern hemisphere, but opposite. Equinoxes refer to when the southern and northern hemispheres are receiving the same amount of sunlight at a given latitude. Now, this unequal amount of sunlight and the seasonality helps explain how air circulates throughout the planet. Where we have areas with a lot of sunlight relative to other areas, we're going to tend to have areas of low pressure. And low pressure means that the air is going to rise up in the atmosphere, and all of that air that is moist with water vapor, because all of that sunlight is causing water to evaporate, think about chapter 2, cools as it rises up in the atmosphere, it condenses and it forms a lot of rainfall at these latitudes. The air will then be moved either northerly or southerly due to pressure changes, and they tend to fall at regions around 30 degrees south and north, causing very arid regions. You can just see from this map that around the equator, it's quite green and lush, and at 30 degrees north and south, it tends to be a bit more arid. Another way that we can have variations in climatic variables is ocean circulation. So if you remember, water is a really good absorber of heat, and it also retains heat and gives it off to the environment when there's changes in temperature. So one type of ocean circulation can be warm surface currents like the Gulf Stream, which carries a lot of warm water at the surface from sort of the Caribbean area up through the eastern seaboard of the United States and all the way to Europe. This is really important for explaining why hurricanes in the fall always follow the same pathway up into the southern United States. But also, all of this warm water carries heat and energy to Europe, which means that you can find palm trees in Ireland. Well, if you move straight across the same latitude, you would certainly not find them in Labrador, Canada. Alternatively, you can have cold water currents, such as the California current, which causes the environment to be a bit cooler, a bit drier. And this is one of the reasons why it's often difficult for the forest fires to be controlled, because the prevailing climate is causing air to be a little bit more arid and dry with less rainfall. Another way that we can have variations in rainfall is just having airflow move over mountains. This is sort of like a microcosm of the atmospheric circulation that we just discussed. As air moves from the ocean to the landfall, the air is going to cool, and also it is going to form more water vapor. As that water vapor condenses as it moves over the mountain, we tend to have rainfall events on the oceans facing side or the lake facing side of the mountains, and on the other side of the mountains there tends to be less snowfall or rainfall. And we can actually see this in the Green Mountains when we have lake effect snow from Lake Champlain. It's one of the reasons why more western facing ski slopes tend to get more snow than eastern facing ski slopes, but those western facing ski slopes tend to have more sunlight exposure in the winter, so there's a trade-off there. There's different ecosystems that we can talk about. So tropical rainforests we tend to find near the equator, and they are predominantly high temperature and high rainfall with a lot of biodiversity. We can see savannas at latitudes north and south of those tropical rainforests. So if we look at savannas, we tend to see them in sort of intermediate zones between the equator and 30 degrees south and north. They tend to have higher temperatures but less rainfall because they're further away from those high levels of sunlight. Grasslands are sort of like savannas, but they tend to have lower temperatures and also less rainfall, so there's a little less biodiversity and maybe less biomass in them. We can tend to find grasslands sort of in areas at latitudes north or south of the 30-degree marks. They still are getting rainfall, but not as much as savannas. We can talk about obviously deserts, where there's the predisposition to have lots of high temperatures, but also very little rainfall. And the lack of water means that daily temperatures are going to swing up and down quite a bit, meaning that plant life and animal life have to be really resilient to those swings in temperature. And obviously, deserts are going to be in these arid areas, notice, where all of the dry air is going to be pressed down back into the surface without that moisture. Chaparral is sort of like a Mediterranean-based biome. Decent amount of rainfall, temperature is not too warm nor too cold. Vegetation is limited, obviously, by the amount of rainfall, so it doesn't tend to be very tree-based, but more herbaceous. And then obviously we can get into the broadleaf and other mixed forests that we're used to. So broadleaf forests, such as the one in Vermont or New Jersey, tend to have a mixed forest that tends to be dominated by deciduous trees, but there can be conifers. And then as we move more northerly, because there's evolutionary advantages to being needle-based, based on water loss during the winter, and also being able to photosynthesize year-round, we tend to see those conifer forests at more northerly latitudes than broadleaf forests. And then we can get into things like tundra, where, again, this is where plant life is going to be predominantly limited by rainfall and also really cold temperatures. Now, when we look at aquatic biomes, there are a couple of different variations that influence where we find life. The first is going to be the photic zone. The photic zone is where we are going to be able to find photosynthetic organisms. And this is really important because this is where we can have biomass accumulate in plethora for consumers to eat. The aphotic zone is always going to be the place where there's no available photosynthetic light. Organisms can live here, but we're not going to be finding those producers. The benthic zone tends to be where nutrients are cycling throughout the ecosystem. So this is where you're going to be finding decomposers of aquatic ecosystems. Now, when it comes to thinking about why there are organisms in a certain ecosystem, we really have to think about what are the factors that are causing that organism to be there, and what does that mean about that organism and its ecosystem. So if we don't see a species in an ecosystem like penguins in Costa Rica, we first have to ask, does dispersal limit its distribution? Are penguins even able to get to Costa Rica? The answer is yes. It's probably because the area is inaccessible, or there's not been enough time for that species to try and get there. But if the answer is no, then it could be a biotic factor, such as other species limiting its distribution. If the answer is no to other species limiting the distribution of a population to an area, then generally it might be abiotic factors, such as sunlight or temperature. If the answer is yes, it's probably because there might be predation or parasitism or competition or disease, making that population not be well suited to that environment. If the answer is no for this question, then we have to think about which factors are going to be limiting that population to that ecosystem. So chemical factors can be things like water temperature, oxygen amount, especially in water ecosystems, salinity, pH, even soil nutrients can limit plant life. And there's other physical factors such as temperature, light, the soil structure, the prevalence of fire, how moist the air or the soil is. And these can be really important for structuring an ecosystem and thinking about how they change over time. So for example, in Vermont, we're finding that the temperature is increasing, the amount of water that we get is also increasing, and that's influencing the soil structure of microbiomes, specifically types of bacteria in the soil. And that's causing, believe it or not, maple trees to be less prevalent in Vermont forests. There might be a time in the next 100 years where these chemical and physical factors are going to make maple trees not able to survive well in Vermont forests. And there's ways that we can test this. We can look at how different species limit or influence other species being involved in here. So this is a classic study looking at the amount of seaweed cover in an aquatic ecosystem in the ocean. And scientists wanted to test, do limpets or sea urchins really have a role in covering or influencing seaweed cover? If you notice the control where we have both urchin and limpets present, there's basically no seaweed cover. It's basically a desolate ecosystem without any producers. And seaweed's also really important for creating the benthic zone, having structure in terms of erosion by wave movement. When they only removed limpets, notice that the seaweed cover was basically the same, which makes you think maybe that sea urchins might have a stronger control over seaweed distribution than limpets. And lo and behold, when they removed urchins from the environment and limpets were present, seaweed definitely had a much greater ability to grow. And when we removed both, then seaweed really flourished until it almost reached 100%. So that gives you a good example of some predation by those two species on why seaweed may or may not be present in an ocean ecosystem. Now, when we look at species in ecosystems, when they are present, it is important to know how they are dispersed. We can have clumped, uniform, and random. And a lot of this is going to be based off the lifestyle of an organism. Do they need a lot of space or not a lot of space? How are their reproductive events occurring? And also, are they territorial or not? Many plants tend to be randomly dispersed based on maybe wind or water pollination events. Smaller organisms tend to be clumped, maybe due to a lack of mobility, and certainly larger organisms that tend to be territorial or need more resources are often uniform in their dispersal or relatively uniform. Another way that we can think about species in an ecosystem is how they survive throughout their life cycle. So assuming that we have 1,000 humans, I'm going to call these some sort of rodent, and oysters throughout their life cycle, humans tend to have a high survivorship all the way till the end of their maximum lifespan. And this has a lot to do with the amount of offspring that we have, how we take care of our offspring, and also the extent to which we live long lives. A lot of smaller mammals or birds or insects that might have less prenatal care might have a lower survivorship curve because they're having more offspring, and also the care that they give to those offspring might not be enough, so they have a higher mortality rate. And finally, things that tend to produce thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of offspring tend to be what we call type 3 species, where, if an oyster has 1,000 eggs that it puts out into a bay, maybe only 1 or 2 of those eggs is going to be fertilized and developed into a new oyster. And this is important because this gives us some information to think about how populations change over time. So when we talk about the change in a population in an ecosystem, we're really thinking about births and immigration influencing a population positively, and deaths via competition or predation or disease or parasitism, and emigration bringing that population down. The way that we can think about the rate of increase in a population is where we just add the first 2 positive factors and we subtract the 2 negative factors. If we ignore immigration and emigration, we can often look at a population's growth rate by just looking at birth rate and death rate. This is, however, very rare unless we have island populations. Immigrations and emigrations almost always occur. It's very easy for a deer to cross the border in New Hampshire to get into Vermont. So populations are always in flux based on these 2 factors. Now we get to some of the stuff that you definitely need to know for the AP Bio exam. We're going to be talking about a couple different types of equations when it comes to population dynamics. You don't need to memorize these for the exam, but you do want to know what the variables mean and how exponential growth is different than logistical growth. And also whether or not there are factors in an ecosystem that might limit population growth, make it positive or negative, and how those populations are dispersed. So the population growth rate of a population can just be pretty simply mathematically described as delta n over delta t equals b minus t. So delta n is the change in the population size. Maybe it's positive 500 or negative 500. Generally, t will be some unit of time that makes sense based on the organism's life cycle. It'd be pretty foolish for me to talk about years if I'm talking about a bacteria that lives for 1 or 2 days. Likewise, it's probably not a good idea for me to talk about the human population on the scale of seconds. And we're really just going to be determining this by looking at births minus deaths. Now, the per capita rate increase, meaning what is the per capita rate of increase, is just given by R equals B minus M. So births, so B being births and M being, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on this, so I'm going to type this in the caption for you to feel good about. I am sorry. Whoa. Now, zero population growth occurs when the rate equals the death rate. So R is going to be 0 when we don't have any change in a population. And obviously, the change in population size can now be written as delta n over delta t equals R to the nth. So we're going to just be thinking about what is the rate of population given the size of the population. That should make intuitive sense because a population of 1,000 and a population of 10,000, given the same rate of increase, the 10,000 population will be growing at a larger rate in terms of the net population. Now, the first type of growth that we can talk about is exponential growth. And exponential growth is just the population increase under idealized conditions. Everything is perfect, including low predation, low competition, great resources, abiotic factors that are positive for that population to thrive. Under these conditions, the rate of increase is at its maximum, denoted as Rmax. That means theoretically all of the viable adults that could have offspring are going to have offspring, and the maximum number of those offspring should survive. And that's just going to be the change in the number over the change in the time, where we're applying the rate of maximum increase to the population currently. And obviously you can see that the rate is going to influence how quickly our population grows. So a rate of 1 is going to lead to not a 2 times fold factor in terms of rate of population increase, but an exponentially greater. Because this is the rate, as it exponentially increases, the difference between 1 and 0.5 will get bigger and bigger. And we can see this in some populations. So when we look at the elephant population in Kruger National Park in Africa, really low population of elephants due to predation and poaching, you would start to implement conservation measures, protected land, protecting the elephants themselves, and also reducing predation from other organisms. Suddenly, there's a lot of good factors causing elephant population to just exponentially increase. Now this Rmax that you can see here, what's almost a straight vertical line, is not sustainable forever, but for about 10 to 20 years, elephants really had the perfect conditions to grow quite rapidly. Notice the change isn't that astronomical. We're only approaching 8,000 elephants now, but given elephants' long lifespan, being a type 1 species, with maybe 1 calf per mother every few years, and one elephant might only have 2 or 3 offspring in their lifespan, this is a really substantial increase. Now, exponential growth can't be sustained forever. There's always going to be changes in an ecosystem that are either directly related to a population growing or just indirectly related because ecosystems are not stable. A more realistic population model that sort of thinks about the limits of growth is what we call the logistical model, and includes this notion called carrying capacity. You might have talked about carrying capacity in earth science when maybe you've talked about the number of humans that can survive on planet Earth, but it's really the maximum population that an environment, the Earth, a country, a forest can support. Carrying capacity varies with the abundance of limiting resources. Limiting resources could be biotic or abiotic factors that are really important for a species and a population and an individual to survive and have offspring. The logistical model, which is a slightly more complicated model, is looking at the change in n over t, where we're still applying the Rmax, but we're doing k minus n, where we're thinking about how does the number of individuals relate to the carrying capacity. And what this means is the rate of growth is going to slow as this population gets closer to n, or k, I'm sorry. So if I know a species has a carrying capacity of 1,500, Rmax is going to stay the same, but this 1,500 minus n over 1,500, this logistical model, is going to cause my rate of growth to slow as we approach 1500. This is called the inflection point. This is half of my carrying capacity. This is the point where the population goes from growing to slowing due to constraints of the population on the ecosystem. There might be fewer resources, there might be more competition, there might be predation, there might not be enough space. Suddenly the population is going to be slowing down. And we can see this in populations that either don't overshoot their population or do overshoot. So sometimes populations tend to overshoot their carrying capacity, have a die-off event, and then the population starts to stabilize. This often has to do with a lag between the growth rate and the birth rate of a species and the available resources. Now, two types of populations can exist. We can have case selection, where species tend to be really heavily dependent on their carrying capacity for their growth rate. These tend to be larger organisms, type 1 species with longer lifespans. Think humans, elephants, bears. And there's R selection, or density independent selection, where smaller organisms, type 3 species, and shorter lifespans really are all about maximizing that reproductive event. We tend to see more overshoots in more R-selected species than K-selected species. This is more of a rapid boil, and this is a slow simmer when it comes to population growth change. Another thing that we can just look at in terms of changes in populations or differences is parental investment. This is sort of related to RNK selection in type 1, 2, and 3. There are some organisms, such as dandelions, that grow really rapidly and release a large number of tiny fruit or seeds into the air. Maybe one of these 100 dandelion seeds is going to become a dandelion. Well, the Brazil nut tree takes a much longer and slower time to grow, and it invests a lot more energy in a larger seed with more protective mechanisms, and that might mean more Brazil tree nuts survive and become trees themselves, relatively proportional to dandelions. Now, there's two types of ways in which populations can be impacted by changes in ecosystems, and we call these density-independent populations and density-dependent populations. Density-independent populations have populations where birth rates and death rates do not change with population density, meaning that there are factors or characteristics of that population where resources might not be limiting to their ability to be having more offspring. Density-dependent populations have birth rates fall and death rates rise with population density. This is often due to resources, but there's other reasons why this might occur as populations get larger. One could be disease. Think about the prevalence of COVID or other infectious diseases. The greater the density, now it's showing. So obviously predation is one mechanism that can limit populations. Higher densities of organisms that can be predated mean that there's going to be higher rates of kill. We can have territory where larger mammals start to compete with each other based on available land. Believe it or not, the effective population of Yellowstone's grizzly bear population is 10 times more than what Yellowstone can have, so the bears aren't as successful with thriving in that ecosystem. Then obviously disease. More concentrated populations means that diseases can increase in terms of infection rates and also mortality rates, which is why it should be no surprise that the general tendency of COVID has been for larger cities to have higher rates of infection. This, however, has changed slightly as vaccination rates have changed. So now we see lots of rural areas that should have been more density independent now become density dependent because there's not enough people that are vaccinated. So the death rate of COVID is going to be rising due to that increased transmission rate. To sum up, because my slideshow wasn't working, density-dependent birth and death rates are sort of a negative feedback system that regulates growth. These factors are going to change that are either going to promote or inhibit increased birth or death rates, and those could be competition, obviously, territory, disease, predation, even toxic waste. When we talk about things like lead contamination in water, it's going to impact populations in more dense cities than more rural communities. I hope this has been insightful for you and helped you with Chapter 40. Please let me know if you have any questions. And again, I am going to make sure that in the caption, I properly explain R equals B minus M. Thank you and have a good day.